Well, it's not going to affect us fertility physicians in terms of how we perform IVF, but it will affect how what we do with cryopreserved embryos. By ruling that an embryo has the right of a child, it makes it to where it's up in the air, what we can do once they are cryopreserved. A few different types of patients or scenarios where someone would want to cryopreserve embryos who is undergoing IVF would be, well, first I'll just walk you through the process, okay? So the process is we stimulate a woman's eggs. We get as many eggs as we can. We usually fertilize all of them, and then we try to get as many embryos as we can. And sometimes that's 1, sometimes that's 5 or 6. We could get as many as 10. And when a couple is ready for their transfer of an embryo, we usually do about 1 at a time. So if a couple does end up using 5 embryos and gets 3 children from it, and they have 3 embryos left, or however many, at that point we're left with the question, well, what can we do with those? There's the option, there's several other options, but one of those options is to discard those embryos because we're done with them and they are ours, ours meaning the patient's. And this law sort of ties our hands to that. Another scenario is we will perform genetic testing on these embryos prior to cryopreserving the embryos. We do that between 5 and 7 days after fertilization at the blastocyst stage, and we take a little biopsy off the placenta. Then we cryopreserve the embryos, and about a week later we know which embryos have a normal number of chromosomes and which ones have an abnormal number of chromosomes. The common practice is for patients to say, well, I'm not wanting to transfer the ones with an abnormal number of chromosomes simply because those have an extremely low chance of a live birth, in the range of less than 1% chance of a live birth. And so they're not making that decision based on trying to avoid a child with defects. They're making that decision on trying to increase their chances of each transfer being successful. But once those are now cryopreserved, well, what do we do with them? And so at that point, we're left with the question, well, should we even do genetic testing? Because we're going to be left with these abnormal embryos that we now can't discard. We don't have definitive answers at this point. I have high hopes that this is a big misunderstanding. I think the judge was upholding the Alabama law as he should. I think the Alabama law was written with good intentions, and I stand behind it. I think if anything, the law did not do diligence in addressing a detail like this. And I've got high hopes that the legislatures are going to do the right thing and just add an amendment that clarifies this in no way ever was intended to apply to IVF embryos.
Got it. And so what advice would you give now for like other practices, practicing now with the ruling? Like what advice would you give them?
Well, I'm not in any position to give other practices advice, but I can tell you that our practice is not going to change our practice of IVF. We're not going to be doing anything that we didn't otherwise offer, but what we will be doing is reconsenting our patients and just informing them of this decision and letting them know what could be in store for their stored embryos, so that if they wanted to change their course, they have that option.
And for those patients who were considering IVF, kind of what would you say to those patients?
I would say that this should not change anything at all in that decision. There are several different ways to skin the cat, so to speak, and we will sit down and go through all the options, but the actual IVF process is not going to be affected at all.
Awesome. Anything that I'm missing that you think is important that I didn't add?
Well, I'm not in any position to give other practices advice, but I can tell you that our practice is not going to change our practice of IVF. We're not going to be doing anything that we didn't otherwise offer, but what we will be doing is reconsenting our patients and just informing them of this decision and letting them know what could be in store for their stored embryos, so that if they wanted to change their course, they have that option. I would say that this should not change anything at all in that decision. There are several different ways to skin the cat, so to speak, and we will sit down and go through all the options, but the actual IVF process is not going to be affected at all. I just think it's important for everyone to realize that this argument, where we are right now, trying to attach this to a bill that was trying to protect a fetus in utero, it is a completely separate issue, 100%, than having embryos in an IVF lab at day 5 to 7. A day 5 to 7 embryo is night and day different than anything they were talking about in that bill.